Die! I want the money! The scream arrived as if from another life, a raw, guttural exclamation that folded into the wind and carried over the edge of the cliff. For a second, the world held its breath. A gull beat slow circles, waves struck the rock below like a clock counting down, and a man stood at the very rim with his hands empty and his face white as bone. He was not supposed to be there. He had not planned to be the center of anyone's violence. He had brought only a sweater and the stubborn hope that somewhere between one last walk and a small, brave confession, something might change. Instead, the shout came out of his son's throat, thin with panic and brittle with rage. The shove, quick, ugly, irreversible in the headlong moment, became the thing that rewrote a life and began, without anyone noticing, to rewrite an inheritance. They called him Geraldo Morales. Once he had been the kind of man whose name appeared in the business pages and in polite columns about philanthropy. A factory owner who'd made choices early and hard, who had kept his promises, and who in the years after his wife's death had retreated into the quiet rooms of his old house, into the ritual of a teacup at dusk and the slow, careful cataloging of memories. He kept photographs in a walnut box. He read the same poems on the same Tuesday nights. He kept, too, a fragile hope that the children who had grown and drifted would show up one day and stay. His children showed up because they needed what he had. Ricardo's calls were short and sharp, like someone used to taking shortcuts. He spoke about numbers with an intimacy reserved for lovers. "Dad, it's just a few transfers," he'd say. "We can sort it. You'll help us keep the business afloat." Patricia's messages were smoothed and practiced. She knew how to spell gratitude in tones that suggested investment rather than affection. They asked for construction loans, for advances against future dividends. They thanked him for the holidays as if debt were a family ritual. Each request felt to Geraldo like a paper cut, small, repeated, and raw. Helena Santos, who came 3 afternoons as a caregiver, was the one who stayed when other faces passed through. She brought hot meals and a fierce steadiness. She understood the names of medicines, but also the names of the old songs that made Geraldo close his eyes. Where the children spoke in spreadsheets, she spoke in consolation. Where the children calculated, she noticed. The way his hands trembled when he looked at his wife's empty chair, the way he lingered over the photograph of a birthday cake where everyone was smiling badly and unforgivably young. One damp October afternoon, with the sea wind a steady hand at the curtains, Geraldo told them both what he had been thinking. He'd give it all away. Not a rumor, not a trial balloon, not some half-formed statement made to appease a conscience. He invited them to come for a walk at the cliffs, an old view he loved, a place he said he wanted to breathe the salt before deciding the next step. "I want to see your faces when I tell you," he said to Helena quietly. "I want to see if it changes anything." They came, not together at first. Fashion and empire had schedules. Ricardo arrived late, the smell of the car still on him. Patricia, trailing with perfume and a sigh that said she had better things to do. They all walked to the edge where the rocks cut the water like teeth. The place had a narrow path, a railing that had seen better days, and the horizon that made men small. Geraldo stood with his hand on the railing, fingers white, and looked at them the way a gardener looks at a hedge he has tended for years. "I've decided to give the company to charity," he announced, voice low, "to set up a fund for the elderly, for those who work with us, all of it." For a moment there was a kind of stunned silence, a small and brittle thing that could have been the end of a quarrel, not the beginning. Then Ricardo's mouth curved, not into a smile, but something carved from habit. He stepped closer, palms open like someone trying to negotiate with a storm. "You can't be serious, Dad," he said. "You worked your whole life. "I can be. I will be. It's time I did the right thing." Patricia's eyes narrowed. She conjured an expression of wounded dignity. "You know we'd never survive without you. We need support. We need time to reorganize." "You're not hearing me," he said, and his voice trembled with the strangeness of saying what he'd been afraid to say for decades. "I don't want my money to be your lifeline. I want it to be used by people who remember what it's like to have no lifeline." Helena watched them from a little behind, her hands tucked deep into her coat. The wind pulled at her scarf. She saw the way Ricardo's eyes flicked to the horizon and then down to the slack of Geraldo's hands. She noticed in the small, telling micro-expressions that people who spent afternoons by hospital beds become adept at, that the children had not come for a visit, they had come for an accounting. After he announced the donation, a fissure opened, not like a clap of thunder, but a slow spreading crack. Ricardo's face hardened. His voice lowered into something that belonged to boardrooms and to contracts. "If you do this, Dad," he said, "it destroys everything. Your grandchildren." "They're not mine," Geraldo replied. "They're mine by blood, yes, but not in how they've been treating me. Maybe it's time to test whom I can trust." Patricia's eyes flicked to her brother and back. "Don't be dramatic," she told him. "No one wants to lose you." "She wants the obituary on the front page," and the sound was like a thrown rock. They bickered in a way that belonged to families everywhere. Sharp, rehearsed barbs until the air grew too thin, and Geraldo, exhausted by the slow work of pleading with human hearts, suggested they walk a little further down the path. The cliff offered an old bench, a view of the fishermen below, a private world where decisions could be stated plainly. He didn't expect the surge of fury that answered his kindness. He didn't expect the way his son's hands would clench a space that ought to be sacred. He didn't imagine the unloving thing hiding behind all those well-cut suits and polished smiles. When Ricardo pushed, it was a sliver of a second, more an act of reflex than of deliberation, and yet nothing in the sliver could be called accidental. Fingers met fabric, a shoulder found purchase, Geraldo's feet found air. The world unfolded with a terrifying, slow precision, wind pulling at the hem of his coat, the bench receding, his hands clawing at sky. The gulf opened like a photograph being torn. He could have died there. He heard the memory of his wife's laugh, a bright line of light. He thought of the photographs in the walnut box. He felt a long, terrible vertigo and then wet, choking cold. But the world does not always heed the designs of men who wish to end things quickly. The bay below the cliffs was more forgiving than the ledges suggested. Rocks jutted, yes, and the sea boiled and hissed, but there were currents and coves that sometimes swaddled things back to life. Down below, Mauricio and Tomas, two fishermen familiar with the cliffs, the way other men know the knobs of their own hands, heard the commotion from above. They watched as the man's body hit the water, and without ceremony, they lowered a dinghy and pulled him out, coughing and blew and saying nothing because that useless breath was all there was in the first immediate minutes. From the edge of the cliff, it was chaos. Ricardo screamed, Patricia wiped her face and called someone on the phone with a voice lubricated by panic and instinct. By the time the fishermen hauled the sodden man into the boat and rowed toward the harbor, Ricardo and Patricia were already in motion, thinking of statements and lawyers and how a will might be interpreted. They wanted to fix reality into a shape that served them. The first impulse, where cruelty meets convenience, is to make a story that sells. In the hours that followed, headlines appeared in hurried fonts and in urgent tones. Local magnate dies in tragic fall. Foundations to honor his memory. Family mourns, community in shock. Photographs of Geraldo as he had been in other times, smiling, set beside his wife, hand on a child's shoulder, slid across news feeds. Patricia, with a handkerchief pale as powder and mascara running like a confession, practiced something that could be mistaken for grief. Ricardo, making sure the camera caught his eloquent sadness, whispered to an aide and to a lawyer, "We move as if everything is already done." Helena watched the theater with a face that spoke of people who serve and who wait. She had found Geraldo after the fall in a side room of the hospital, not in the main ward where the cameras might feasibly have been, but in a back corridor where nurses moved with the focused indifference of people who have to keep patients breathing. The first diagnosis was severe hypothermia and concussion, bruises, contusions that might have been life-saving or life-ending, depending on what the doctors found. In the days that followed what the public called the accident, the town behaved as towns do. There were vigils, a sudden rain of bouquets at the steps of the house, the street lamps shining like solemn candles. The children scripted their sorrow and the cameras welcomed it, hungry for narrative. The community performed condolence. The factory lowered its flags. The foundation that would be named after Geraldo began, quietly, to be spoken of as a future reality even before the body was laid to rest. Geraldo did not die. He survived in the way survivors do, broken, bewildered, with a brain that scraped raw against the bed of consciousness. He woke in a room that hummed with hospital instruments and the smell of saline, and when he opened his eyes he found Helena at his side, a small figure like an island of steadiness. "You're awake," she said, and the relief she felt in the simple present tense was almost visible. Her voice was a practiced calm. Her hands had the cleanliness of someone who had touched a million fragile things and not been crushed. Around her wrist was a watch with a face that showed seconds like a countdown she refused to acknowledge. He tried to smile. The movement felt foreign. "You look like you could use a cup of coffee," he whispered, because there are simple human talismans, a cup of coffee, a familiar joke that insist on being offered even at the edge of catastrophe. She laughed once, a thin line. "First you tell me how your legs feel," she said, and when he tried he discovered the ache of every bone, the truth of his age. Beyond the curtains, muffled and distant, he could hear the world arranging itself, reporters asking for a statement, a voice on a phone reciting family names like a docket. He tried, from the place where thoughts are slow and uncertain, to make sense of the pieces. He'd gone to the cliffs seeking a small moral test, an honest confession. He had not expected to find himself in the middle of a violent slide. He had not expected to be struck down by his own blood. He had not expected the authorities to be so obligingly quick to close the book. People talked freely around him. Nurses murmured. Doctors drafted the polite arc of a medical record, and Helena listened with a kind of ferocious attention that made the air feel taut. On the second day, while he slept with the duvet of bruises and bruises, a voice, sharp and practiced, drifted into his room through an open door. Ricardo, the son, was speaking on the phone too close to the bedside to be naive. The speakerphone had been left on. "We need to lock it down," Ricardo said. "If we move now, Dr. Torres will sign. We can present the family statement, the funeral and the foundation, Patricia's name on the plaque. This is clean, Dad. This is clean." Helena's hand tightened on the sheet. Geraldo, half dreaming, felt something inside him shift. The world around him moved like a court of masks. He had been trying to see if his children loved him. He had not intended to turn that test into a stage for a crime. The words got under his skin, not because they were vulgar, they were only businesslike, but because they bore the unmistakable stamp of calculation. The house of his life, he realized with a bitter clarity, might be built on numbers rather than on hearts. Ricardo's voice continued. "People will be sympathetic. The foundation will look generous. We just need a press release and a couple of charitable partners. Trust me, The auditors will sign off." Geraldo's head hurt. He had no desire to be part of any theater. He had, in his slow way, always believed that transparency was its own defense. Perhaps that belief had been cowardly, perhaps naive. He thought of his wife's hands arranging flowers on a kitchen table, the way she had valued small kindnesses. He thought of the fisherman who had pulled him out of the water and rowed him to the shore as if he were a man worth saving. He thought, too, of the small, stubborn conviction forming in the hollow of his ribs. He could not die if the people who would profit from his death were allowed to do so unquestioned. Helena heard the words, saw the way his jaw tightened, and when the nurse left the room and the hallway settled into the hospital's breathing, she leaned close and spoke with the hush of someone who knows how to be entirely honest when the stakes are gravity high. "You heard them," she said. He nodded. "They think I won't come back," he said, and in his throat there was a humorless sound. "They think I'm gone. They've already been talking. They've been drafting statements, choosing logos. I heard Patricia asking if the plaque could be bronze. Bronze. For what he'll be replaced with, they already are choosing colors." "Why would they do this?" Geraldo asked, as if the question were a kind of experiment. "Have I been that absent? Do they not remember?" Helena's eyes softened. "They remember how to make use of what you made. That is not the same as remembering you." There was a beat where every sound in the room pooled into a gravity. "The truth," she said plainly, "could be used as a weapon or as a shield. If the world believes you dead, they will move fast. It's easier to close a case than to open an investigation. Everything will look tidy." Geraldo thought about the fishermen again. He thought about their hands, the sea salt smell on their jackets, the way their faces had been lit the way honest labor lights a person. He thought about how different the people at the cliff had been. He thought, finally, of the recorder he had slipped into his inner coat pocket that morning, a small thing Helena had placed there at his suggestion, a talisman of precaution more than anything else. He had not told the children. He had not told his lawyers. He had placed it because he was old enough to distrust sudden generosity and cunning enough to want proof. "Do you think it's still working?" he asked. His voice was small. Helena's hand went to his sleeve, and she smiled with the kind of fierce, almost amused gratitude that had become her private expression. "We have something. We have a few minutes of audio. Not much, but sometimes a single phrase is enough." They listened together to the raw file the small device made, the hiss of wind, the scrape of shoe on gravel, the low exchange of a family that had argued long enough to have words already prepared for one another. In it, in nervous tones and in the selfish rush that happens when people think a door has closed, there were lines that could be read as collusion, a reference to moving things along, an offhand joke that sounded too practiced to be merely flippant. If he doesn't come back, it's sordid. Not a confession, not yet, but an ecology of convenience that would not stand well in a court of public opinion. It was enough, perhaps, to sow the seeds of an idea. Geraldo listened, and a plan congealed in the way that plans do when survival and purpose meet. He would let them think he'd been taken from them. In a world that rushes to finalize tragedies because it is easier to catalog than to question, he would accept the performance in order to expose the performance. He would not rush the law. He would not take vengeance into his own hands. Instead, he would become an instrument of truth. Helena understood immediately. She had spent nights with patients who wanted to test the world's values. She had seen grief turned into ledger entries and had watched dignity stripped from people who could not fight with their injuries. Her loyalty was not sentimental, it was moral. She had been present when Geraldo wept for the first time in years at the sight of a young nurse holding an elderly man's hand. She had seen the kernel of generosity in him. It was enough. We'll need walls and time and the fishermen. They can be sworn to secrecy. They saved you. They won't want reward, but they will do this because it's right. Do you think I can pretend? He asked, and the thought was a child trembling in the doorway of a much older man's mind. He felt the ache of deception. He felt the shame and the strategic lucidity. He thought of the bowls of soup she had brought. He thought of the way she had settled his pillows in the night. "We'll pretend for a purpose," Helena replied. "Not forever, just until the truth is clear." There was a quiet that only two people who know the shape of a life's end can share, the hush of cataloging what must be done, in what order, with what sacrifices. Outside, the town rehearsed its eulogies. Inside, two conspirators in a hospital room measured the line between justice and theater. Ricardo and Patricia moved as expected. Patricia arranged flowers and called an event planner. Ricardo called Dr. Sebastian Torres, the family's old counsel, and spoke in the clipped, efficient voice of men who think that legalities happen in straight lines. "Get the papers ready," Ricardo whispered into his phone in a corridor that smelled faintly of antiseptic. "We need to move quickly," he said. "We can't have this hanging." They were making the map for a public closure. They were, in their haste, drawing lines that would box in truth, or at least try to. Back in the hospital room, the plan to fake death did not yet have a legal architecture. It was, at the beginning, only a human maneuver, a fragile moral invention, to allow the world to believe one thing so that it could be drawn into seeing another. The fishermen would be complicit out of the simple decency of having saved a life. Helena would be the anchor, the presence at the bedside who could control access and narrative. The recorder would be their small, obstinate witness. There were obstacles. A man who had been declared dead in the public eye would be required, legally, to have a death certificate, a body, an autopsy. The press would want photos, the factory a statement. People would want the now familiar shapes of mourning. To step into a lie, even for a noble end, required more planning than courage. There would have to be a place to hide while the truth was gathered. There would have to be allies. Geraldo thought about the garden where his wife once planted roses. He thought of the hospice in a neighboring town, an old friend who ran it, someone who owed him small favors, and of the trust he had seeded over the years among people whose rhythms were not controlled by market days and board meetings. He thought of the fisherman's shed, where nets hung like sleeping beasts. He thought about the smallness of his remaining power and the precise way he could, even now, leverage it toward something that resembled justice. "We won't do this forever," he told Helena, "but if I have to be a ghost to make my children into something better than they are, then perhaps it's a small price to pay." Helena's gaze searched his face. "Are you ready to become invisible for a while?" she asked. "To watch them grieve and build monuments and think they've won while we gather what's true?" "I am," he said, and the word carried the weight of someone who has lived long enough to prefer the slow intelligence of moral correction over the quick satisfaction of revenge. They had little time. The world, impatient and hungry, would move to archive his life with headings and past tenses. They had to act in the thin spaces between the public's rush to conclusion and the legal obligations that might pin them down. For now, there was a single clear step to take: ensure there would be no body available for an autopsy, arrange a believable funeral scene, and create at the same time a cache of proof that could not be reduced to rumor. Geraldo's mind turned to the small recorder again. He asked Helena to retrieve the file, and together they listened to the moments captured, the wind, their shoes on gravel, Ricardo's offhand line about, "If he doesn't come back, it's sorted." Listening to that file made the plan less abstract and more righteous. The evidence was not dramatic enough to convict in a court yet. It was merely a light pressed to the seam of a garment, revealing thread. It was something the public might understand. Outside the hospital, tragedy had a schedule. The funeral parlors took calls. Friends and associates began composing letters. For the cameras, it was an opportunity to rehearse a week's worth of content. For Ricardo and Patricia, it was a chance to step into roles they'd practiced all their lives, the bereaved heirs, the sorrowful custodians of a legacy. For the town, it was a scene that would become for a while a story everyone shared, the local magnate who had fallen, leaving behind questions like loose change in the gutter. But the fishermen had other ideas. When Mauricio and Tomas were given a quiet cuppa by Helena in the back room of a church where old nets and hymnals hung together, they did not speak like men who wanted payment. They spoke like men who had been given a duty. "Think of your families," Mauricio said, bearing the reason of his actions simply. "When we pull a man from the sea, we don't ask why he fell. We ask if we can get him home. This is home. If he asks us to keep it secret to save himself from a wrong, then we keep it." Tomas scraped his thumb along the grain of the wooden table, a gesture like turning a page. He said, "We know the cliffs. We know where the currents give. If there's a way to make the world think he's gone, we can help. But it's not for the money. It's because it's right." They pledged, solemn as any. That night, as the town arranged its mourning like a dressmaker fitting a garment, Geraldo closed his eyes and felt the ghost of the cliff and the sting of the salt and the steadiness of a woman who had few illusions and more decency than the sons who called him father. He was tired of being used as currency. He had, in a life of calculations, less appetite for reform than for repair. He wanted to repair the thing that most people forget to mow, the moral landscape of a family. Helena was awake in the chair by his bed, hands folded under her chin. She had arranged the small things with the attentive precision of a person who knows how intangible hopes break on small details. The recorder was safely tucked away. The fishermen had been paid in the currency that mattered, gratitude and a promise that what they had done would be honored in full. "Tomorrow we'll need to move the body," she whispered. "Not for long. We only need it to be plausible. We'll dress it, take pictures that don't show the face, and arrange the rest. People accept what they can see. They will fill the blanks. The important part is getting a copy of the conversation into the hands of someone who will use it." He thought of lawyers who could be trusted and of the long memory of a man like Dr. Sebastian Torres, who had, once, defended a worker on principle and lost a friend for doing so. He thought of the old man's soft voice, the way he could cut through complicated things with an elegant sentence that felt like justice. Perhaps they needed him, perhaps not, for now the step was smaller. They would let the world believe in a death and then quietly run the needle through the seam to reveal the thread. Geraldo closed his eyes and let the hospital's rhythm rock him. There was a cold in his bones, a sense of being undone and of being remade at once. He had always thought of his life as a ledger, credits, debits, accounts reconciled. Now he saw his life as a kind of evidence, not of his success, but of what people do when left unchecked. The next morning the cameras came with the earnestness of graveyards. Patricia chose a black suit that made her look like a widow in training. Ricardo delivered himself of a statement that had been professionally worded. The funeral scene was set to be a tidy, tasteful thing. The public expected closure. The public wanted to move on. They did not expect the peculiar stillness of the hospital room where a man and a nurse had decided to make a lie serve a truth. "Are you afraid?" Helena asked him before the charade began. Not the fear of dying, but the fear of watching one's name be used by people who would never have the courage to own their actions. "I'm afraid of what it will cost me," he admitted. "Not money, everything else." She squeezed his hand. "Then we do it for more than revenge." Her voice was steady like an oath. "We do it for those they would have trampled, for the fishermen, for the workers, for the people they think are invisible." He nodded. In that nod was the seed of a decision that would change not only his family's public narrative, but the future shape of the fortune he'd built. He felt small, ridiculous, and yet more purposeful than he had in years. He had been marked by his children's greed. Now he would be the architect of its unveiling. And so they moved. The fishermen took the body, the hospital gave them the necessary space, and a theater of mourning began to be carefully arranged. In the glare of the coming days, statements, a funeral, a foundation announcement, someone would step forward to say quietly that they had heard something on a recorder and that a story was not as neat as it looked. They would not shout, they would assemble facts. But at the moment when the world stopped to remap its sorrow into headlines, one face watched from the wings and calculated anew. Ricardo. He stood at the edge of the room, eyes darting, hands clenched. He believed he'd achieved the impossible, to inherit by the fastest route, but something about the way the fisherman moved, the way the nurse's eyes met him, quietly dismissed plans he had already made. He felt a prickle, the first hint that a performance could be undermined by truth. Patricia, with her bouquet held like an accessory, moved through the rooms composedly, talking of plaques and ribbons as if mourning were an event program. There was in her voice a small barbarism, the kind that can be mistaken for efficiency. They both left for a while to deliver their statements to a hungry press. They rehearsed their grief. The town believed them because it wanted to. Geraldo, wearing borrowed blankets and the pale armor of a man who had survived something that almost killed him, lay back and listened to the world go on with its filling of blanks. He had made a choice. The stage was set. The first act, a lie for a cause, had begun. What he did not yet foresee was the particular piercing moment when someone, a broadcaster, a lawyer, a friend, would speak up and open the door. He did not know whether his recorder would capture the language of guilt clean enough to hold in public view. He did not know if the fisherman's accounts would be believed. He did not know whether the law would bend like reed or stand like oak. He only knew with a clarity sharpened by pain that once the missed moment is seized and represented, there is no going back. Outside, the tide pulled at the shore in rhythms that had nothing to do with grief or business. Inside, a man who could have been buried in a cardboard box of headlines made an act of will. He would be a ghost to the world long enough to expose the living. He would test his children with a theater of death, and in the quiet between the actors, uncover a truth that might mend more than just an estate. At the edge of the hospital window, a gull wheeled, then dove. The sea below the cliffs kept its secrets and gave some away. The town would choose its allegiances tomorrow. Tonight, in a room full of monitors and low voices, 2 hands were clasped in the dark, and a plan was born that would force a family to confront the cost of what they'd chosen when they loved him only because they could inherit him. They moved quickly because the world outside the hospital liked tidy finales. If this story is gripping you, stay until the end. The truth arrives in a way no one expects. The funeral that followed was everything a televised grief could be. Satin drapes, a florist's choreography, a priest's practiced pauses. Cameras parked like silent jurors. Patricia arranged donations in tiers and sent a carefully worded statement that spoke of a life devoted to others, while she chose a bronze sample for the plaque. Ricardo kissed a photograph with a professional sorrow that had been rehearsed in hotel rooms between conference calls. The town bowed its head, and the factory lowered its flags. Columns were written about legacy and generosity. Behind the scenes, a different rhythm governed the days. Geraldo, hidden in an old hospice outside of town, breathed the thin air of anonymity. The fishermen watched the house with the modest vigilance of men who had been given a trust. Helena, in the guise of a pillar of the household, managed the grief performance with a surgeon's economy, consoling phone calls to relatives, directing florists, slipping a brief note here and a hesitant phrase there to shape the public story. Friends and acquaintances who arrived to offer condolences were given rehearsed lines and, when appropriate, directed toward the casket. The first thing they needed, Helena insisted, was leverage beyond the clipped audio from the cliff. The recorder would stir suspicion, that was true, but suspicion could be shrugged off as the bitterness of the recently bereaved, a conspiracy for which the market had room. They needed corroboration, words collated with documents, a paper trail that matched the tone of the recorded voices. Helena made quiet inquiries. A housekeeper who had been dismissed under odd circumstances remembered seeing hastily packed folders on a study desk the week before. A junior accountant, new and keen, had copied an email thread because he thought it looked irregular. A receptionist at the bank, too young to understand loyalty but old enough to notice movement, had printed a proposal and left it in the wrong place. Small errors became the mortar of a larger construction. Helena collected names, borrowed time and patience, and stitched them together. She took the findings to Dr. Sebastian Torres in a square, undecorated room that smelled of old books and coffee. He read the snippets with slow attention, his eyebrows knit, not with surprise, but with the tired recognition of a man who had seen the same human patterns repeated. "We will not raise a voice of accusation without foundation," he said, and his voice carried the kind of calibration men like him regard as a moral instrument. They had a problem of plausibility. A family that had lost a patriarch moved with the urgency of grief and the calm of those who already owned the narrative. Lawyers could, and often did, move mountains of paperwork in a day when the world wanted closure. Dr. Sebastial, who had been a young idealist once and had not entirely forgotten that no legal instrument is merely technical, proposed an approach that was surgical rather than theatrical, collect enough detail to create a public picture that could not easily be explained away, and use a compliant forum, a broadcast with a reputable journalist, to reveal it in a controlled way. The journalist was Julia Mendez, a woman with an adericity for telling complicated stories in plain language. She had a reputation for tempering indignation with calm and for making facts land without cheap theatrics. Helena called a friend in the station, and after a short meeting in which Dr. Sebastial spoke of duty rather than vengeance, Julia agreed to listen. She came to the hospice under the pretense of a general profile piece about the elder's philanthropy. She left with a small envelope of recorded fragments and a scrupulous sense that this could be a story that mattered. The proof they assembled was not a single smoking gun. It was a mosaic. There were snippets of audio where Ricardo's voice, tense and annoyed, referred to making the announcement ourselves and not letting anything complicate it. There were messages in Patricia's drafts folder discussing the plaque and donors, phrased in a currency that read more concern for optics than for loss. There was a scanned copy of a bank instruction dated the morning after the incident that suggested movement of assets pending executive approval, a note unsigned but real enough to demand explanation. An invoice hinted at early payments to the firm that had been contracted to design the foundation's brochure. A junior accountant's printout revealed a possible attempt to reclassify certain reserves as charitable beginning funds before any formal approval had been given. None of it in isolation spelled out a crime. Together, however, the fragments began to hum with intent. Yulia listened, and when she had heard enough, she did what honest journalists do. She asked the difficult follow-up questions and demanded original sources. Helena provided them. The fishermen put their names to sign statements. The accountant left a copy of the draft emails for Yulia. The young receptionist produced the printed proposal, hands shaking in the public office, like someone who had, for the first time, chosen a line over the convenience of silence. There were moral risks in what they planned. The public could misconstrue. The interview could become a spectacle. The law could intervene in ways that would stifle the larger truth. Yulia, careful and unflinching, assured them she wanted a fair presentation. "We will air what we can confirm," she said, "and keep the rest as context. This isn't a trial by television. It's a conversation forced into a brighter light." They rehearsed nothing and rehearsed everything. In the hospice room, Geraldo and Helena listened to the audio files again and again until they could parse the inflections like a cardiologist reads an ECG. Guilty phrases, careless jokes, a tone in Ricardo's voice that carried entitlement. These were the heartbeats they would present. They would also show the documents that indicated premeditation, or at least opportunism. And they would invite witnesses who had direct, honest claims to what happened. The fisherman who had pulled a man from the water, the young accountant who had seen the drafts, the receptionist who had printed the proposal. On a Saturday night in the town's largest studio, the country watched a program called The Ledger, a platform that balanced consumer affairs with human interest and had a reputation for making corporations answer. Yulia sat across from an empty chair. The set had been arranged so that, when the truth was ready to be unveiled, someone could enter and speak without interruption. The audience in the hall was a mix of ordinary citizens and a small number of invited guests, the fishermen, Helena, Dr. Sebastião, and a few employees from the factory who had agreed to tell their stories. Geraldo had written nothing for the show. He had prepared only this, a short list of names and an instruction to read letters the workers had written if he ever regained a public stage. He trusted Helena and Dr. Sebastião. He trusted the fishermen more than he trusted most institutions. He trusted also something softer, that the facts would sit on people in a way that words without evidence could not. When the cameras rolled and the lights warmed the faces of the audience, the first clip played. Wind, footsteps, Ricardo's voice carried on the recorder as if from another life, the cadence clipped with impatience. The studio did not shout, it drew in breath. The clip was short, unadorned, an offhand sentence, "If he doesn't come back, it's sordid," delivered in the business-like tone of someone treating human life like an accounting variable. It was not a confession of murder. It was, however, a line that could no longer be seen as mere bitterness. Yulia let the clip breathe, then addressed the camera with the kind of evenness that makes viewers lower their guard. "We have more, and we have people willing to speak to what they saw and what they handled." The fishermen were called to the stage. Mauricio, with weathered hands and a voice that had always been used to simple certainties, described the moment a body met the sea and how they had pulled a man who could have been swept away into forever. Tomas, quieter and more methodical, spoke of the currents and the way the bay had somehow returned a man who should have died. They spoke not with drama, but with the economy of fact. The audience listened as if being given a map, and maps alter behavior. Then Dr. Sebastián stood. He did not wave papers like a prosecutor. He explained, calmly that in the days after the incident there had been unusual movement of documents and communications, and he presented two things: a scanned bank instruction and a draft of the foundation's formation, with a proposed donor list that had been circulated before the public had even been told of the tragic accident. He did not say the documents were proof of a crime. He asked a simple question instead. Why prepare the architecture of benefit before you had confirmed the death of the benefactor? The children sat together in the audience. Ricardo's jaw was a landscape of tiny, taut lines. Patricia's hands were in prayer. They did not speak until forced to, and when Ricardo stood, the cameras narrowed like the eye of a moral lens. "What you are showing are fragments," he said, and his voice tried to hold the old dignity of a man who saw himself wronged by accusation. "We are grieving. My father was taken from us." Julia steered with an interviewer's steadiness. "You were discussing the foundation before a death certificate was issued," she said. "You also left a group chat message that mentioned moving things now. How do you explain that?" Ricardo's answer was an attempt at plausibility: panic, an urge to prepare, a son's desire to manage things for the community in the face of sudden loss. He spoke of respect and of steering the company through uncertain times. His words had the texture of someone who had grown used to arguments that revolve around spreadsheets. He did not deny the documents existed. He called them expedient drafts, a precautionary measure. Patricia, given a microphone as the second point of contact, spoke of grief and legacy and the burden of continuing. Her face, for a moment, broke, and the audience softened. But then Julia played another clip, a fragment captured in an unguarded minute where Patricia, her voice low and close, joked about a plaque and the family's name in bronze. The joke was callous in the way jokes are when they reveal priorities. The public's sympathy thinned like diluted paint. When they played the second audio clip, the one that had been the seed of everything, the studio inhaled. There, in a raw exhale of sound, Ricardo's voice could be heard with an edge, anger in the throat, a sentence that contained a demand. It was not a how-to. It was an exclamation that had become the headline, a raw die, less an instruction than an impulse translated into language that betrayed the mind behind it. For a moment, the world on camera held the same tremor the cliff had given the sea. The phrase ricocheted through the lights and into the faces of those who had watched the first clip. People on set looked away, some covered their mouths. Not because it was novel, words like that are not unique, but because it contrasted so brutally with the image the children had tried to build: caring heirs, keepers of heritage. The conversation shifted. Calls poured into the station, social feeds flared. People who had never cared about the internal accounting of a family business found themselves enraged at a smallness that felt like cruelty. The result was not blood justice, but social pressure. It was headlines and investigations that would now have to be answered legally rather than with a public statement. The prosecutor's office, slow but predictable when a public pressure applied, opened a preliminary inquiry. The factory's board froze discretionary transfers until documentation could be reviewed. A major bank placed a temporary hold on any scheduled wire transfers, citing standard procedure. None of this was a guarantee of conviction. It was the industry of checks and delays, the way institutions protect themselves when a scandal nudges the margins. On the show, after the noise of recordings and papers and fishermen's plain testimony, Geraldo stood up from a chair in the wings and walked slowly onto the set. The room fell into a hush that had little to do with television and a lot to do with the human magnetism of seeing a man who had been declared dead come back into the light. Cameras zoomed with the awed insistence of an audience being offered a miracle without religion. Geraldo did not speak for long. He did not need to. He walked straight to the camera and, without theatrics, addressed those whose faces were on the screens of millions. He read, simply, the names of the workers whose letters had been left in his hospice room, names of men and women whose work went unnoticed until it was needed. He read the first letter aloud, an old foreman's note about dignity, and another from a woman who had kept the factory's accounting books for 20 years and whose hands knew numbers the way other people know prayer. Those letters became the emotional center of the show. They were not there to shame the children. They were there to remind the country of what money is supposed to be for. If the revelation had begun as public theater, it folded into something more tender, a public lesson on stewardship delivered by a man who had been betrayed and had chosen with Helene's counsel to turn betrayal into testimony. Then, in a moment carefully calibrated by Dr. Sebastial, the will that mattered most was introduced. There had been prior amendments, simple language that set conditions. If fraud or manipulation were proven in relation to his death, the majority of the estate would be channeled to a foundation for the elderly and for the factory's workers. The amendments named an independent trustee, an outline for an oversight committee, and a clear instruction that the person who had served as his primary carer, Helena, would be given an honorary managerial role in the foundation's board. The clause itself read like a ledger of moral judgment. It did not seek revenge, it sought correction. The estate would reward care and service rather than familial entitlement. It was, in essence, a last test, the one he had failed when he walked to the cliff. Now the test found its legal vector. On live television, with bulldozers of public discourse and the slower wheels of law grinding in the background, Geraldo gave the decision. "I will not allow my life to be monetized by those who call me father only for balance sheets," he said. "This money will go to those who have devoted themselves to others in service, not to blood that counts its worth by inheritance." He did not say the words out of malice. He said them with the weary wisdom of someone who had lived long enough to see patterns repeat. He appointed, in his will, Helena to lead the newly constituted fund. He asked that a measurable percentage of the estate be distributed to programs that supported elder care and vocational training for the factory's lower-paid employees. He offered, without malice but with firm boundaries, a path for his children, work and service. If they wished to be restored, they would have to demonstrate it, not by words but by years of work alongside those they had dismissed. The reaction was immediate and sharp. Ricardo's face, already taut on the set, imploded into a mask, anger, then stunned incredulity. Patricia went pale and then rigid, the practiced grief cracking like porcelain. For days they traded accusations and lawyers. For weeks the prosecutor's office sifted through emails and deposits and statements, and for months the factory's boardrooms were full of paper and counselors and public relations officers trying to keep a business afloat while reputation sank. But the immediate impact was not merely punitive. Helena received, with a steadiness that astonished some and calmed others, the responsibilities of stewardship. She accepted with the kind of humility that had been her signature from the first day she fed a man in a quiet house and listened to the music of the lives he had saved. She did not accept for the money. She accepted to turn resources into hands that worked. Geraldo's decision to put his wealth into institutional care and vocational training did more than punish. It redirected. The foundation he had built in his head and put into law became a vehicle for restoring dignity to people who had worked quietly for years. The first grants were modest and practical: funds to update safety equipment in the factory, scholarships for workers' children, support for community elders who could not pay for medicine. The press, which loved a single headline, found it harder to sensationalize small, steady changes. The foundation's work was one of slow repair. As for the children, their arc was not simple. The legal process moved deliberately. There were inquiries and hearings, and in the end, formal charges were limited by the fact that the recordings, while corrosive of moral standing, were not an unambiguous confession of criminal intent under the law. That distinction saved them from the worst the state could bring. It did not, however, save them from the rest of the world's judgment. The stock markets responded, not wholly fairly, but predictably. Allies retreated. Patricia lost the board seats she had once considered her natural inheritance. Geraldo did not exile them. He offered a pathway that matched his sense of justice, a period during which they would forfeit any claim to the estate and instead work inside the foundation and the factory under the supervision of an oversight committee that included members from the workers' ranks. It was effectively a probation of character. "You want to be part of the family of this town again?" he said to them privately one evening when the public frenzy had quieted into whispers. "Then earn it where real work happens, not as managers with power, but as laborers who learn what others do every day." Ricardo's acceptance was brittle. He wore the uniform of the shop floor like a foreign coat. Patricia's first days sweeping the canteen felt like a humiliation measured by pride, but in their faces were, at least sometimes, signs of an inflection. Work has an odd pedagogy. Those who do it learn the dignity of tasks. The children, who had measured their lives in accounts and appointments, found themselves accountable in ways that mathematics does not model. 2 years later, the town had a new rhythm. The foundation, led by Helena, ran programs that were quiet and effective. Evening classes for older workers to learn computer skills, a fund for emergency medical expenses vetted by a panel that included a cashier and a foreman rather than only lawyers, an apprenticeship program that connected school leavers with paid internships in the factory and with scholarships for vocational training. Helena walked among the people she had once visited with soup and small talk, and now stood as a steward, translating resources into something comprehensible: dignity. The fishermen were given official recognition, not as the subjects of a heroic tale, but as custodians who had acted without calculation. A plaque, bronze, modest, was placed near the shore where the cliff met the sea, not in memory of one man's near death, but in gratitude for simple human rescue.
Mauricio and Tomas were offered positions advising on coastal safety. They accepted with a shy pride that concealed how little public fame had meant to them all along. The children continued to learn, sometimes slowly, often too late. Ricardo, who had once been harsh and efficient, found a rhythm in the factory that made him sweat and think. He learned to come home with dirt under his fingernails and a different sort of exhausted humility. Patricia discovered that the way people speak to you changes when you sit on the same stool for 8 hours and share the same meal. Their redemption, if redemption is the right word, was not theatrical. It was halting, contaminated by old habits, and occasionally selfish. But it was real enough to be recognized by people who had watched the arc of lives for decades. What remained constant was the fragile reconciliation between purpose and wealth. Geraldo, who had once kept a ledger for everything, found new currency in the letters he read aloud on television years before. He sat in a small office at the foundation, not to manage daily operations, but to listen, and he watched those letters become programs that paid bills and created futures. His time was not endless, no man's time is, but what he had wanted was not revenge. He had wanted, in the way old men sometimes want, to right the assumptions that had allowed his children to think he was disposable. On a gray morning in the second year after the cliff, he walked again to the edge of the water, not to test his fate, but to feel the wind with less anxiety. Helena walked beside him. They stood for a long moment and said very little. "You were right," he told her once, as if telling her were a kind of benediction, about waiting, about the fishermen, about the small things. She smiled sideways, the smile of a woman who knew the cost of loyalty. "We were wiser together," she said, "but you did the heavy lifting. Living through it is harder than dying to make a point." He laughed softly, a sound that had less of triumph than of surprise at having survived not just the sea, but the moral tests of his own heart. "I wanted them to know what mattered," he said, "not for me, for them." Helena squeezed his hand. "And they have time," she replied. The town, which had loved its headlines and then grown tired of them, had settled into a quieter awe, not the theatrical one of a man returning from the sea, but the ordinary awe of people who see change come one small check at a time. The foundation's first graduates, young men and women who had learned welding, carpentry, caregiving, and basic bookkeeping, walked into their jobs with a kind of earned stride. The factory's floor hummed with a different cadence. It was not perfect, but it had a new edge of mutual accountability. Ricardo and Patricia passed through months of interviews and for a time of public scorn. They took up the terms set before them, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes with a patchwork sincerity. They did not find immediate absolution, but when an older foreman, the one whose letter Geraldo had read on national television, accepted that Patricia had shown consistent work in the canteen and had learned to place the right amount of salt for the soup, he placed a small, hard hand over hers and said, "Keep going." The scene was not grand. It was real. In the end, the cliff that had opened and nearly swallowed a life became for the town a parable about what inheritance should look like, not a transfer of rights without responsibility, but a covenant in which wealth becomes a responsibility and care becomes the metric of worth. Geraldo's final accounting was not tidy. There were lawsuits, settlements, and long bureaucratic nights, but the core of his decision stood firm. The fortune he had amassed would be repurposed to reward service over entitlement, to lift those who had been unseen, and to create a structure where dignity could be more than a letter on a plaque. When he died years later, it was in a small bed surrounded by people who loved him not because of his money, but because of the gentler sentences he had chosen to live by. The headline that followed was less gleeful than the first: "A Life Redesigned." The foundation bore his name, but not as a monument. It bore his name as an instruction. And the lesson that stuck in the town's muscles was this: the people who truly wait for you are not always at the table. Sometimes they stand where the sea meets the rock, with hands ready to pull you back. Sometimes they sit in the slow rooms of care and stitch the seams of other people's lives. The ones who say die in a moment of fury are not always the ones who hold the last truth. The heir had pushed a man off a cliff and had never really seen who was waiting: the fisherman, the nurse, the quiet witnesses who would not take money for a rescue. In the end, the money had become a test. It had revealed what people would do under pressure and allowed the final judge to be not just the law, but the moral ledger that communities keep. Justice in that small place did not arrive as immediate revenge. It arrived as exposure, restitution, and a slow architecture of dignity that outlived fury. Helena continued to answer letters, to visit elders, to sit with those who had been hurt. She did not see herself as a savior. She saw herself as someone who had been given stewardship and learned how to steward. The fishermen went back to their boats, to nets and tides,
carrying less fame and far more peace. Ricardo and Patricia learned in small humiliations and modest labors that earning the trust of a community is a longer road than inheriting a name. And over the cliff the gull still circled, and the water kept its honest, indifferent rhythms. The town no longer needed the spectacle it once craved. It had found in a man's near death and deliberate return a more demanding appetite, to measure each other not by the size of our accounts, but by the steadiness of our hands when called to help.